Hi, this is Greg Thomas, and welcome to the Welsh American Channel. Today we present part 2 of our examination of a significant revolutionary and American of Welsh descent, Thomas Jefferson. We have already presented videos on many different revolutionaries of Welsh heritage who made the founding of the new republic possible. Some of these include flag maker Betsy Ross, Martha Washington, wife of General and President George Washington, signers of the Declaration of Independence like Lewis Morris, William Floyd, Francis Lewis, Button Gwinnett, and many others, military generals like Danel Morgan, John Cadwalader, and the designer of the first 6 frigates of the United States, Joshua Humphreys. In this video, we will continue to survey the life of Thomas Jefferson as the first United States Secretary of State, Vice President of the United States, President of the United States, and his retirement years. Be sure to see our video on his early life and career. It's entitled Thomas Jefferson, Welsh American Revolutionary Leader of the United States, Part 1. First, let's have a quick review of his ancestry. Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, named his 2 plantations after the birthplaces of his treasured family. The one named Shadwell was named after the birth location of his beloved wife Jane in Shadwell, England. His second plantation was named Snowdon, after the birthplace of his Welsh Jefferson ancestors who lived near Mount Snowdon. Thomas Jefferson wrote in his unfinished autobiography, quote, "The tradition in my father's family was that their ancestor came to this country from Wales and from near the mountain of Snowdon, the highest in Great Britain. I noted once a case from Wales in the law reports where a person of our name was either," and he spelled PL period or DEF period. We can assume since it was a law report, it was his shortened form for plaintiff or defendant. And one of the same name, meaning Jefferson, was secretary to the Virginia Company. These are the only instances in which I have met with the name in that country. I have found it in our early records, but the first particular information I have of any ancestor was my grandfather." End of quote. He then went on to discuss his grandfather's lands in Virginia. We ended part 1 with Jefferson living in Paris and serving as United States Minister to France. Because of this role, he was unable to attend the 1787 Constitutional Convention. Jefferson supported the new Constitution from afar, but desired the addition of the promised Bill of Rights, which was added soon afterward. Jefferson left Paris for America in September of 1789, intending to return to his home in Monticello, Virginia. However, President George Washington had other plans for Jefferson and appointed him the country's first Secretary of State, forcing him to remain in the nation's capital. Some pressing issues at the time were the national debt and the permanent location of the federal capital. He opposed the national debt and preferred that each state retire its own debt. This was in contrast to Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who desired a consolidation of the state's debts by the federal government. Hamilton also had bold plans to establish the national credit and a national bank. Jefferson had opposite political and philosophical views from Hamilton. Jefferson's primary vision of America was one of virtuous farmers in a nation of smaller cities and rural interests. Hamilton, on the other hand, had a primary vision of America as a manufacturing nation with a strong commercial banking economy and large influential cities. It ends up that Hamilton's vision eventually prevailed beginning in the 19th century. Hamilton also favored a national capital close to the major commercial centers of the Northeast, while Washington, Jefferson, and others with an agrarian interest wanted the capital further south. Eventually, the Compromise of 1790 was struck, permanently locating the capital on the Potomac River, and the federal government assumed the war debts of all original 13 states. This resolved two of the pressing issues. Unfortunately, these early patriots were now fragmenting into partisan political factions. Jefferson, along with Congressman James Madison and other Democratic Republican organizers, favored states' individual rights and local control of power. They opposed a federal concentration of power, which Hamilton favored. Hamilton sought more power for the federal government, and they became known as Federalists. Soon there were competing newspapers supporting these various factions. In May of 1792, Jefferson became alarmed at the political rivalries taking shape. He wrote to Washington imploring him to run for re-election that year as a unifying influence. Historians recognize this letter as the earliest delineation of Democratic-Republican Party principles. Jefferson supported France against Britain when the two nations went to war in 1793, but his arguments in the cabinet were undercut by French Revolutionary envoy Edmond Charles Genet, sometimes pronounced Jeanette, open scorn for President Washington. Jefferson sought a return to private life and resigned the cabinet position in December of 1793. In the presidential campaign of 1796, Jefferson allowed his name to be nominated, but lost the Electoral College vote to Federalist John Adams, 71 to 68 votes, and was thus elected vice president. As presiding officer of the Senate, Jefferson assumed a more passive role than his predecessor John Adams. He cast only 3 tie-breaking votes in the Senate. During the Adams presidency, the Federalists rebuilt the military, levied new taxes, and enabled the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson believed these laws were intended to suppress Democratic Republicans rather than prosecute enemy aliens, and considered them unconstitutional. These laws also limited freedom of speech and of the press for citizens, particularly when anyone was critical of the president or the government. Jefferson contended for president once more against John Adams in 1800. Adams' campaign was weakened by the unpopular taxes and vicious Federalist infighting among themselves. The Democratic Republicans ultimately won more Electoral College votes. Jefferson and his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, unexpectedly received an equal total. Because of the tie, the election was decided by the Federalist-dominated House of Representatives. As a surprise to many, Alexander Hamilton lobbied Federalist representatives on Jefferson's behalf, believing him a lesser political evil than Burr. On February 17, 1801, after 36 ballots, the House elected Jefferson president and Burr as his vice president. The transition between Adams and Jefferson's administrations proceeded smoothly, marking a watershed in American history. As historian Gordon S. Wood writes, quote, "It was one of the first popular elections in modern history that resulted in the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another," end of quote. Jefferson was sworn in as president by Chief Justice John Marshall at the new Capitol in Washington, D.C. on March 4, 1801. Jefferson and Marshall were second cousins from the Randolph side of their families. However, Marshall was a Federalist and an opponent of Jefferson politically. In contrast to his two predecessors, Jefferson exhibited a dislike of formal etiquette. Plainly dressed, he chose to walk alongside his friends to the Capitol from his nearby boarding house on Inauguration Day instead of arriving by carriage. His inaugural address struck a note of reconciliation and commitment to democratic ideology, declaring, quote, "We have all been called by different names, brethren, of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. End of quote. Ideologically, he stressed equal and exact justice to all men, minority rights, and freedom of speech, religion, and press. Jefferson stated that a free and Republican government was the strongest government on earth. He nominated moderate Republicans to his cabinet, including James Madison as Secretary of State. Jefferson was the first American politician to bring the handshake to the White House proper, rather than bowing as a greeting. He used it to take the office slightly down to earth. Jefferson pardoned several of those imprisoned under the Alien and Sedition Acts promoted by John Adams. Jefferson strongly felt the need for a national military university, producing an officer engineering corps for a national defense based on the advancement of the sciences rather than having to rely on foreign sources. He signed the Military Peace Establishment Act on March 6, 1802, founding the United States Military Academy at West Point. Jefferson took great interest in the Library of Congress, which had been established in 1800. He often recommended books to acquire. In 1802, Congress authorized Jefferson to name the first Librarian of Congress and formed a committee to establish library regulations. The 1803 Louisiana Purchase was completed during Jefferson's presidency. It added 827,987 square miles, which doubled the geographic size of the United States. Spain had ceded ownership of the Louisiana Territory in 1800 to France. In 1802, Jefferson instructed James Monroe and Robert R. Livingston to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and adjacent coastal areas. In early 1803, Jefferson offered Napoleon nearly $10 million for 40,000 square miles of tropical territory. Napoleon realized that French military control was impractical over such a vast remote territory on another continent, and he was in dire need of funds for his wars on the home front. In early April 1803, he unexpectedly made negotiators a counteroffer to sell all 827,987 square miles of French territory for $15 million, or about 4 cents per acre. This is worth between $375 and $400 million in today's dollars. U.S. negotiators accepted the offer and signed the treaty on April 30th, 1803. Word of the unexpected purchase did not reach Jefferson until July 3rd, 1803. He unknowingly acquired the most fertile tract of land of its size on Earth, making the new country self-sufficient in food and other natural resources. The sale also significantly curtailed European presence in North America, removing obstacles to U.S. westward expansion. Most thought that this was an exceptional opportunity, despite Republican reservations, including Jefferson, about the constitutional authority of the federal government to acquire the land. Afterward, the United States Senate consented to ratification of the treaty with a vote of 24-7 on October 20th, 1803. On the following day, October 21st, the Senate authorized Jefferson to take possession of the territory and establish a temporary military government. Jefferson anticipated further westward settlements due to the Louisiana Purchase and arranged for the exploration and mapping of the uncharted territory. He sought to establish a U.S. claim ahead of competing European interest and find the rumored Northwest Passage. This was a hoped-for sea lane between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Congress was persuaded in 1804 to fund an expedition to explore and map the newly acquired territory to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson appointed fellow American of Welsh descent Captain Meriwether Lewis and his second lieutenant, William Clark, to lead the Corps of Discovery between 1803 and 1806. In the months leading up to the expedition, Jefferson tutored Lewis in the sciences of mapping, botany, natural history, mineralogy, astronomy, and navigation. He gave Lewis unlimited access to his library at Monticello, which included the largest collection of books in the world on the subject of the geography and natural history of the North American continent, along with an impressive collection of maps. The expedition lasted from May 1804 to September of 1806 and obtained a wealth of scientific and geographic knowledge, including knowledge of many Indian tribes. Jefferson refuted the contemporary notion that Indians were inferior and maintained that they were equal in body and mind to the people of European descent. In keeping with his Enlightenment thinking, President Jefferson adopted an assimilation policy towards American Indians known as his Civilization Program, which included securing peaceful U.S. Indian treaty alliances and encouraging agriculture. Jefferson was nominated for re-election by the Republican Party, with George Clinton replacing Burr as his running mate. The Federalist Party ran Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina, John Adams vice presidential candidate in the 1800 election. The Jefferson-Clinton ticket won overwhelmingly in the Electoral College vote by 162 to 14, promoting their achievement of a strong economy, lower taxes, and the Louisiana Purchase. In 1808, Jefferson was the first president to propose a broad federal plan to build roads and canals across several states, asking for $20 million, alarming fellow Republicans who were staunch believers of limited government. During the Revolutionary era, the states had abolished importing slaves through the international slave trade, but South Carolina reopened importing slaves once again. In his annual message of December 1806, Jefferson denounced these violations of human rights regarding the international slave trade, calling on the newly elected Congress to criminalize it immediately. In 1807, Congress passed the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves, which Jefferson signed. The act established severe punishment against the international slave trade. Unfortunately, this did not address the issue of domestic slavery. It would take a bloody civil war about 50 years later to settle this matter. The British conducted seizures of American shipping to search for British deserters from 1806 to 1807. American citizens were thus impressed into the British naval service. In December of 1807, news arrived that Napoleon had extended the Berlin Decree. This banned British imports globally. In Britain, King George III ordered redoubling efforts at impressment, including American sailors. But Congress had no appetite to prepare the U.S. for war. Jefferson asked for and received the Embargo Act, directed against both France and Britain. This was an alternative to war that allowed the U.S. more time to build up defensive works, militias, and naval forces. However, this triggered economic chaos in the United States and was strongly criticized, resulting in Jefferson having to abandon the policy a year later. The government could not prevent American vessels from trading with the European belligerents once they had left American ports, although the embargo triggered a devastating decline in American exports. Jefferson was frustrated and exhausted from the challenges of his second term in office. In December of 1807, Jefferson announced his intention not to seek a third term. Shortly before leaving office in March of 1809, Jefferson signed the repeal of the Embargo Act. In its place, the Non-Intercourse Act was passed, but it proved no more effective. The day before James Madison was inaugurated by his successor, Jefferson said that he felt like, quote, a prisoner released from his chains, end of quote. After his presidency, Jefferson remained influential and continued to correspond with many of the country's leaders. Jefferson had long envisioned a university free of church influences where students could specialize in new areas not offered by other colleges. He believed that education created a stable society, and it should provide publicly funded schools that were accessible based solely on ability. In 1819, Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. He organized the state legislative campaign for its charter, and with the assistance of Edmund Bacon, purchased the location. He was the principal designer of the buildings, planned the university's curriculum, and served as its first rector upon its opening in 1825. The university had a library rather than a church at its center, emphasizing its secular nature. This was very controversial at the time, and Jefferson received a lot of criticism for it. Jefferson bequeathed most of his reconstructed library of almost 2,000 volumes to the university. Only one other ex-president has founded a university. Millard Fillmore founded the University of Buffalo in 1846. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had become good friends in the first decades of their political careers, serving together in the Continental Congress in the 1770s and in Europe in the 1780s. However, the Federalist-Republican split of the 1790s bitterly divided them, and Adams felt betrayed by Jefferson's sponsorship of partisan attacks upon him. Jefferson was angered by Adams' appointment of Federalist midnight judges just before Jefferson's presidential inauguration. This was an attempt to stack the federal judiciary with Federalist. The two men did not communicate directly for more than a decade after Jefferson succeeded Adams as president. As early as 1809, mutual friend Benjamin Rush began to prod the two through correspondence to reestablish contact. In 1812, Adams wrote a short New Year's greeting to Jefferson, prompted earlier by Rush, to which Jefferson warmly responded. This initial correspondence began what historian David McCullough calls, quote, one of the most extraordinary correspondences in American history, end of quote. Over the next 14 years, Jefferson and Adams exchanged 158 letters discussing their political differences, justifying their respective roles in events, and debating the Revolution's impact on the world. In retirement, Jefferson enjoyed upgrading Monticello. Although generally completed by 1809, Jefferson continued work on Monticello until his death in 1826. He also spent his retirement overseeing his lands and relishing his hobbies and inventions. Jefferson conducted annual visits to Poplar Forest, a second plantation and retreat home in Forest, Virginia. He visited this plantation beginning in 1810 and ending in 1823. Jefferson frequently brought his granddaughters to the house after 1816. His visits ranged from a few days to week-long stays. In 1821, at the age of 77, Jefferson began writing his autobiography of Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1790, in which he said he sought to, quote, state some recollections of dates and facts concerning myself, end of quote. He related that his ancestors came from Wales to America in the early 17th century and settled in the western frontier of the Virginia colony, which influenced his zeal for individual and state rights. He focused on the struggles and achievements he experienced until July 29, 1790, where the narrative stopped short and unfinished. In the summer of 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette accepted an invitation from President James Monroe to visit the country. Jefferson and Lafayette had not seen each other since 1789. After visits to New York, New England, and Washington, Lafayette arrived at Monticello on November 4th. Jefferson's grandson Randolph was present and recorded the reunion, and I quote, "As they approached each other, their uncertain gait quickened itself into a shuffling run, and exclaiming, 'Ah, Jefferson! Ah, Lafayette!' they burst into tears as they fell into each other's arms." End of quote. Jefferson and Lafayette then retired to the house to reminisce. After an 11-day visit, Lafayette bid Jefferson goodbye and departed Monticello. For decades, Jefferson lived beyond his means. He enjoyed many fine luxuries he frankly could not afford. Jefferson's approximate $100,000 of debt weighed heavily on his mind in his final months, and it became increasingly clear that he would have little to leave to his heirs. In February of 1826, he successfully applied to the Virginia General Assembly to hold a public lottery as a fundraiser. His health began to deteriorate in July of 1825 due to a combination of rheumatism from an arm and wrist injury and intestinal and urinary disorders. By June of 1826, he was confined to bed, and on July 3rd, overcome by fever, Jefferson declined an invitation to attend the 50th anniversary celebration of the Declaration of Independence in Washington. During his last hours, he was accompanied by family members and friends. Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826 at 12:50 p.m. at age 83 on the anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. In the moments prior to his death, Jefferson instructed his treating physician, saying, quote, "No, doctor, nothing more," end of quote, refusing laudanum, a tincture of opium. But his final significant words were, "Is it the 4th? Or this is the 4th?" When John Adams died later the same day, his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives," though Adams was unaware that Jefferson had died several hours earlier. The sitting president at this time of the United States was Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, and he called the coincidence of their deaths on the nation's 50th anniversary as, quote, "visible and palpable remarks of divine favor," end of quote. Shortly after Jefferson died, attendants found a gold locket on a chain around his neck, containing a small faded blue ribbon around a lock of his wife Martha's hair. Jefferson was buried at Monticello under an epitaph that he wrote, and here it is. "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." You will notice that Jefferson does not mention his service to the nation as Vice President or President of the United States. This may reflect his belief that these were not personally satisfying years of achievement in his life. Jefferson was fascinated with languages and philology. He read in at least 6 different languages. Upon his death, included in his library was a Welsh to English dictionary from 1760. Here is its original title in Welsh. How's that for a title? One is located in the British National Trust collection. It has been written that Jefferson used it to decode all the dispatches that Meriwether Lewis was writing to him in Welsh. I can't prove this, and my research only shows them corresponding together in English. If you have more information to prove this belief, please pass it on, and I will share it with everyone. Jefferson died deeply in debt and was unable to pass on his estate freely to his heirs. He gave instructions in his will for disposal of his assets, but his estate, possessions, and slaves were sold at public auctions starting in 1827. In 1831, Monticello was sold by Martha Jefferson Randolph and the other heirs. So what is the legacy of this exceptional American of Welsh descent? A short video like this one can't do justice to his many, many accomplishments. Jefferson is an icon of individual liberty, democracy, and republicanism. He is hailed as the author of the Declaration of Independence, an architect of the American Revolution, and a Renaissance man who promoted science and scholarship. Jefferson has been memorialized with buildings, sculptures, postage, and currency. In the 1920s, Jefferson, together with George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, was chosen by sculptor Gutenborglum and approved by President Calvin Coolidge to be depicted in a stone national memorial at Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of South Dakota. The Jefferson Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1943 on the 200th anniversary of Jefferson's birth. The interior of the memorial includes a 19-foot statue of Jefferson by renowned sculptor Rudolph Evans. Evans himself was the Welsh American descendant of Thomas Evans Sr., born in Montgomeryshire, Wales in 1662, who emigrated to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Jefferson Memorial includes engravings of passages from Jefferson's writings. Most prominent among these passages are the words inscribed around the Jefferson Memorial itself. It is a quote from Jefferson's September 23, 1800 letter to Benjamin Rush. Quote, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." End of quote. In the upcoming year of 2026, the United States will celebrate the 250th anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's original Declaration of Independence. All freedom-loving people from around the world will rejoice at the inspiring words written by this bold and independent descendant of Cymru. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel or give us a like, and please feel free to make any comments below. If you'd like to see more biographies of leading Welsh Americans, give us a like. And if you have an individual you would like us to showcase, let me know in the comments below. This is Greg Thomas saying Hoylem Nower. Bye for now.